Welcome to a special episode of the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and joining me today, we're very excited to have Andy Sparks with us. Andy, previously has been an associate professor in exercise physiology at Edge Hill University in the UK, is currently a visiting research fellow at Liverpool John Moores University, and also research innovations manager in the Medicine and Health Medical Department of Martin. For those that have heard of, we've mentioned that product for years on the podcast, and you've seen it all over the place, kind of like pioneers in this simplified carbohydrate intake space. So actually, this is an interesting situation because, Andy, you reached out to me because I covered on a podcast, I was discussing one of the studies that you were involved with, and you said, hey, I'd be happy to jump on and answer more questions if you have them, and hopefully possibly clarify any misrepresentations that I made or misunderstandings. The study that we were talking about, it's a February 2024 study, and I'll read off the title, and this will be linked below for people. It's called "The Effects of a Carbohydrate Hydrogel System for the Delivery of Bicarbonate Mini Tablets on Acid-Base Buffering and Gastrointestinal Symptoms in Resting Well-Trained Male Cyclists." So we covered this one when we were talking, and people were asking if the MAR10 product, the sodium bicarbonate product, is something that they should use. This is interesting because it seems like the first research that's looking into like different vehicle methods for sodium bicarbonate that's proving that this seems to be beneficial rather than whether you're just dumping a bunch of baking soda and water or if you're just, taking a bunch of the tablets. So Andy, with all that said, I'd like to ask you, first of all, great to have you on. And then secondly, can you explain what the problems you were trying to solve with this research? And then we can get into what you observed and everything else.
I think, thanks very much for the intro. I think it's interesting, this area, because the sort of dynamic and the sort of backstory as to my relationship with Morton was that they originally approached me when I was doing some work in this field anyway. And we had this idea that one of the key problems that you have with delivering bicarbonate to be an ergogenic aid is some of the GI upset that you get. So we had this idea about trying to bypass the stomach by encapsulating the bicarbonate in either enterically coated or in delayed release capsules. So that it doesn't.
What does that mean? What is enterically or the?
Yeah, so these are just chemically coated capsules that delay the speed of release, often used in the pharmaceutical industry, really to sort of elongate the length of time it takes you to absorb things. You see these sort of capsules in painkillers very often. The painkillers then release more slowly rather than you having a sudden spike in pain relief and then it tailing off quickly. So we sort of used that idea to see if we could bypass the stomach and therefore reduce some of that bloating and some of the CO2 production that you get when bicarbonate mixes with stomach acid. That's a classic symptom of, I know on the previous podcast you had one of your guests was saying that he was consuming it with orange juice, and that will make things fairly lively for you, shall we say. So the original idea was to try and bypass that. And what we do see there is quite a considerable reduction in the GI upset that you get. So the sort of global gastrointestinal symptoms go down quite enormously. So for me, I get really, really lively when I have traditional methods of bicarb ingestion. As one of my old PhD students, Sanjoy Deb, published a paper on 3-minute all-out exercise using bicarb, and there's I think 11 participants. I'm participant 9. If you want to have a look at it, I'm the only one that gets worse with bicarb in a traditional method, and that's because my GI upset was so severe I couldn't concentrate on what I was supposed to be doing. So you do see these sorts of things. And that's an important thing that we'll come back to in terms of that severity and the individual differences that you get with the response to bicarb. It's sometimes unpredictable, which is really interesting, but it's also very different between one person and the next. So the key thing that we wanted to do with that, we had a PhD student, Nathan Hilton, complete a PhD almost entirely on looking at the enteric and delayed release capsules. We see reduced GI, we see improved performance. But what we do see when we look at what we call the pharmacokinetics of blood bicarbonate, so it's basically how blood bicarbonate responds following ingestion. In some of the methods of ingestion, you see reduced peak bicarbonate change. But the curve is elongated, so it lasts for longer because it's not dumping all of that bicarb straight into the intestine. And that's one of the mechanisms we think is important, because then you don't get lots of fluid shifting. If you get lots of fluid shifting into the intestine, then that's when things get a bit interesting for you, shall we say? That's what you want to avoid.
Have to do the roadside stop. So.
Yeah, you don't want a Tom Dumoulin style pit stop mid-race, do you? That was fructose, by the way, that caused that problem, not bicarb. Anyway, so what we did also notice, though, that whilst you get good responses, reduced GI in that method, and then improved performance, so we did 4-kilometre time trials, so very intense exercise. And then even though you see those positive responses, quite a number of our participants, what they report several hours after exercise is that they then have GI upset, and it's lower GI upset. So that's not very convenient. So for some athletes, they're not bothered by that. If they can use that sort of product and they can deliver bicarb, get an ergogenic effect, and then their stomach upset is many hours after exercise is completed, they're really not bothered by that. Others are much more delicate and particular and don't want any of those side effects at all and won't use it for that reason. And that's what often put people off from using bicarb, is just the side effects. So Morton reached out to me off the back of some of that work, and they were interested in getting some advice about potentially developing this product. And then COVID got in the way, and it sort of changed the dynamic in that relationship a bit. But they did end up funding some work with myself and Lewis Goff, who's at Birmingham City University. He was one of my PhD students, and we collaborate regularly on a variety of projects. We've just actually written an edited book on cycling nutrition, which has come out recently.
Oh, I think I've seen that book. It's what's the title of the book?
It's Nutrition and Supplements for Cycling.
Yeah, very thorough, but also at the same time easy to, not like you're reading like an in-depth paper or anything else. It's actually quite
it's a halfway house. It's not too sciencey. That was the pitch. There is some in-depth science in there, so it's an edited book with lots of different collaborators and contributors. So
we'll link to that down below for people too, so then they can check that out.
Oh, thanks. So that was the sort of dynamic, and they were funding my work, and then we had this idea to do a couple of studies. So one of the key things that came up from the previous podcast was that it's a really interesting study, but there's no exercise involved. So we have actually done that study, and
cool.
We have another 2 studies ongoing. Two are in review currently. The original cycling study that we did as part of this sort of initial funding was repeated 4-kilometre cycling time trials. So a 4-kilometre ride, 45 minutes rest, and then another 4K. And we see improvements in performance in both of the time trials. But importantly, we see reduced GI upset. And then we also see blood bicarbonate recovering much more quickly. And then recovering to pretty much pre-exercise levels by the time you go to do the second bout of exercise. So the pitch was
45 minutes between.
Yeah, the pitch was that's about, we wanted to make it quite arduous, quite a short rest period, but have it similar-ish to the length of time that track cyclists might have between heats, so that they can be assured that, hopefully be assured that the bicarb actually behaves itself and allows them to get a performance enhancing effect on the second bout, and it seems to work well. We've done a 40-kilometre time trial study as well, which is under review currently, and that again shows improvements in performance.
That's really interesting. This is the original study was really looking at whether the hydrogel that Martin has could allow that similar effect of that timed release. So it would go through. And as you said, our outstanding question, or really we said it's important to take this research for what it is in terms of it's researching the vehicle for delivery, but it's not necessarily looking at that. And then, of course, we said that it'd be great to have more research looking at performance, and it's exciting to hear that it's in the works. I have a lot of questions about bicarbonate in general that I would like to ask you, an expert on this, rather than just asking my own understanding or asking, other folks. But this really seems to be your area of expertise. One of the things that I see are just a lot of misconceptions about bicarbonate. Whether they're, a lot of the time it's seen as a similar thing to like, oh, it's like you take a gel, like you would want to take bicarbonate. In other words, it's assimilated to other things that cyclists are prioritizing in terms of intake, along with, carbohydrate, electrolytes, and then you have liquid, perhaps even caffeine. And then in addition to that, you'll have something like bicarbonate. So are there common misconceptions that you've seen or perhaps misuses of bicarbonate? And maybe it's best to cover how we should use it, however you wish to go about that. But really, how can we get our understanding straight on bicarbonate? What's it good at?
Okay, so some of the misconceptions initially, I think, are because if you look through the literature, there's a whole host of studies that show it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Often that's because of the GI upset that's associated with it. So it's almost deleting the potential performance enhancing effect because you don't feel up to exercising intensely. So a study by Brian Saunders, who we've done some work with previously, from 2014, and he did an exercise test. I think it was 110% of peak power output to exhaustion. And when they did that study and reported the full data set, there was no improvement in performance, but removing the people with the worst GI upset showed actually the performance was enhanced. So, I mean, some might say from a strictly scientific perspective that what you're doing there is sort of cherry picking the results to show that something works. And I can kind of understand that, but this is an applied science. And so nobody's going to take a product like that if it upsets their stomach. So it's irrelevant for those people anyway. So you're only going to use it on somebody that actually gets on with it well. Otherwise, that side effect and that distraction will be deleterious to performance anyway. So I can kind of understand why they've done that, and it's really useful for them to have done it. One of the key things that we did with the original or the first Morton study, which came out, was we recruited people that we'd previously had do other studies for us and that we knew had a bit of a history of GI upset with traditional methods of delivery. So I think in terms of misconceptions, the temptation is to misconceive that all delivery methods are the same and will bring about the same outcome. They don't. And so what that means is that you get very mixed findings in the literature because the timing is different for every different ingestion form. The amount of total bicarbonate delivery is likely also to be different. So if you consume it in orange juice, as an example, it's going to react with stomach acid and you're going to lose quite a lot of bicarbonate because it will create CO2 at that point. So the actual delivery is likely to be lower than something that bypasses the stomach. So by trying to bypass the stomach effectively, your total bicarbonate availability essentially goes up. And so that leads to problems when you do things like meta-analyses, because what you should really do if you're going to do a meta-analysis, which is to essentially extract the overall effect for all of the literature across the bicarbonate for different types of exercise, the best way to do that would be to actually separate it based on delivery method. But ideally, you should separate it for delivery method and the timing, because the timing can also potentially have an impact. And there's a bit of a debate about how effective that is. And it will depend on the delivery method. If it's liquid, you see quite a sharp rise in bicarbonate, but then that tails off pretty quickly. If you use delayed release methods, then you see a slightly lower peak. But as I said earlier, there's the curve in that blood response is longer. So it has the potential to be ergogenic for a longer period of time. What we see with the Morton bicarb product, this has been tested extensively with pro athletes as well. It was under development and prototype testing for 2 years with professional cycling prior to its actual launch. And so we've done lots of in-field measurements using the same radiometer. So that's the piece of kit that measures the blood bicarbonate responses. So we've got loads of that data as well that shows that with this method, you get a very high peak. And there's this sort of theoretical window above which, or this theoretical threshold above which, that you've got a greater chance of seeing a potential ergogenic effect. And that's reported to be about 5 millimoles increase. With the some of the people that we see using the Morton bicarb product, we've seen 10 millimole changes, and the average is between 7 and 8. So quite considerable changes.
That's a great spot to talk about how this actually works. Perhaps
Yeah.
we should have started with this too. But what is actually going on? And perhaps assume that I'm in high school and you're explaining it to a high schooler. How does bicarbonate provide a performance enhancing effect in the body? What's going on?
Okay, so there's a couple of proposed mechanisms. The sort of classic one that everyone will have some idea about is that it's what we call an extracellular buffer. And what that means is that in the blood, it changes the pH. So it reduces the acidity of blood, and then it increases the bicarbonate concentration. And the bicarbonate buffering system is what we use to essentially deal with the hydrogen ions which are produced from metabolic turnover. So when we are exercising intensely, metabolism's working at a high rate, we use up loads of carbohydrate, particularly those high intensities. You see high amounts of hydrogen ions being produced. And those hydrogen ions can impact skeletal muscle contractility. And so what you ideally want to do is remove them from the muscle as quickly as possible to allow contractility to work as effectively as it should do. And you need to get them into the blood. And when you move them into the blood, what happens is it creates carbonic acid. So it reacts with bicarbonate, it creates carbonic acid, and then that's dissociated into water and carbon dioxide, and then it's removed as waste. So the more bicarbonate you've got, the more of those hydrogen ions you can essentially deal with. Now, there are some other interesting potential aspects of how bicarbonate might potentially work. So one way is that you might also change the pH, so the acidity of the muscle cell, and in so doing, you're creating a more optimal pH for the rate of the enzymes to work for glycolysis, so the breakdown of carbohydrates in the muscle. So when we do intense exercise, certainly prolonged and intense exercise, the rate of carbohydrate use in terms of its total contribution to energy expenditure is much higher. So if we can optimize that situation, then it might be more efficient to do so. So exercise turnover or exercise performance is likely to be optimized by doing that. Now, there are some additional things by which it might work. And that's sort of the classic issue that we have with ergogenic aids and supplements, is that the nuance that goes with them is often lost in translation. And that's sometimes to do with the marketing that goes around with these products. So if we just take bicarbonate, for instance, and you just assume that all bicarbonate products are the same, we know that the timing's likely to be different for ingestion. We also know that that if you put it in an ergogenic aid that you consume perhaps during exercise, then you won't be able to stomach large amounts of it because, you're wanting to actually fuel at the same time as well. So that wouldn't be too good an idea. So it wouldn't be a good thing to do to consume large amounts all of the time. So the nuance here is always about the timing, the potential mechanisms that it's likely to work through, and then also how it's delivered in the first place. So if you look at something like, if we look at sort of pre-workout supplements, they often have a whole array of different ingredients in them that are all individually shown to be really ergogenic. But in reality, one of the only consistent ones that's in all of them tends to be caffeine. And also, when you ingest all of these different things, the doses are often not quite right for them to be really ergogenic. And then also the ideal timing pre-exercise is likely to be very different, but you're going to consume them all at the same time. So that nuance is lost very often with some supplements and how ergogenic they are. But bicarbonate is no different. So you really have to make sure that you're consuming it with in the right environment, and that the method of delivery is likely to work. What we also know with that acidity issue is that there are some animal studies which hint at the potential for this to reduce pain perception, which would be really, really interesting. There's not a whole host of work done on humans in that area, but it would be very interesting to do that. because if that is one of the mechanisms, that might be one of the reasons why when you do a set bout of exercise or exercise at a set intensity, that your perception of how difficult the task is might be easier. And that's often what we see with bicarb, is that perception of effort is either the same if it's a time trial, but you do more exercise. So relative to power output, it's actually lower perceived exertion. And likewise, we see the same with heart rate and VO2 very often, is that they tend to be the same, but power output goes up.
Yeah,
so there's a few potential mechanisms there.
How interesting. Just speaking from personal experience, all of those, I've seen them either with others or with myself. Yeah, I could see evidence of, or perhaps you could make logic leaps to assume that any of those mechanisms are happening. You mentioned timing. I want to talk about what is the ideal timing prior, like when to take bicarbonate in relation to your exercise.
So with our product, it's about 2 hours before. We've actually done a neat study of a PhD student at the moment, and she's done a neat study looking at menstrual phase and bicarbonate intake, and it changes over menstrual phase slightly. So the rate of absorbance, we think, in the intestine is different based on menstrual phase. So in ovulation, it's slightly different to during menses. One thing is interesting there, though, is that if you took it at 120, because the ergogenic window is quite large with this product, the likelihood is that actually it doesn't really make any difference. But it's an interesting observation, because that actually might add noise to some of the other studies that have used females, is in that if they're at different menstrual phases, the timing might be wrong for the ingestion strategy that they've used.
Is there a specific type of training that this is recommended to go with? From what we've seen, at least I've seen in the research, and then it seems like what's being recommended from you is that there is a window in which you can expect it to have effectiveness. So, if you're going to be riding 24 hours, for example, you probably aren't going to see the benefit across 24 hours. And then is it best paired with a certain type of intensity?
Okay, so that, again, one of the other sort of nuances associated with ergogenic aids is chronic versus acute ingestion strategies. So you might have it ingested acutely, but almost use it in a chronic way, so that you're using it in training to enhance training. We know that lots of athletes are doing that. It's very difficult to measure the precise way in which it's likely to work. So if we look at what the cellular adaptations are likely to be, we know that, again, there's some animal work that suggests that you get increased precursors to mitochondrial biogenesis, which means that the effectiveness and your ability to process carbohydrate is better. So at a set intensity of exercise, you'll end up using less energy. So that might be potentially really quite useful. And also, if you can do more in a training session, you might also stimulate the muscle more optimally. So you might get a better training impulse. That, again, there's some data on traditional methods of delivery with bicarb, but what they do because of the GI upset is they do split dosing and chronic ingestion. So they'll do like 2 grams at 0.2 or 0.1 gram per kilo ingestion multiple times a day for multiple days, and then they'll exercise at multiple times. What is interesting as well, though, is that, and this is partly a caveat, it's certainly on our product, is that we recommend you don't take it more than twice a week. And that's partly because of the sodium load. So the sodium load's quite high. Again, there's some evidence in really well-trained individuals, healthy individuals, that the sodium load combined with long duration or intense exercise probably have no effect on the cardiovascular stress. But in somebody that is not particularly well-trained, then again, we don't know if that would have an impact. So again, that's work we're hoping to do just to make sure, because I guess, we need to make sure, because athletes have a tendency to sort of rip up the instruction manual anyway and do their own thing. So we know that, when you talk to some of the athletes that we deal with, they don't tend to follow the precise instructions. So if they feel like they're getting a benefit from some of the products, they'll use it far more frequently. That might be a great thing, but it might not be, and so we don't know. And so it's important to sort of put that in context, is that the training adaptation and the potential advantage of it from that perspective is potentially very useful. But in a really well-trained group, you're almost not going to be able to to sort of dial into what the precise mechanism is, because it's likely to require a muscle biopsy, which nobody who's really well trained is going to give you. And so that's why you're not going to spend 6 months preparing for the Tour de France, and then a week out you're going to go, yeah, it's fine, just take a muscle biopsy. That's not going to happen. So, and that's why it's very difficult to do some of this mechanistic work, and that's why we have to sort of use some of that evidence base from animal studies, unfortunately, to work it out, or we use less well-trained individuals, but that in itself is problematic. It's problematic because they can't replicate their performances as well when you actually look at how performance changes. And also we know that, their responses and their ability to do exercise is completely different to somebody who is, a world-class athlete. Their capabilities are completely different to normal people.
Yeah. Well, if you want a representation of normal people, I volunteer myself for muscle biopsy work. I'm there for it. So normal people, though, not sure how much that's not tangential even to Jonas Lumigo right now. So so that covers the dosage and the frequency there. In relation to the intensity of the work or the nature of the work that the athlete will be doing, is there an ideal pairing for bicarbonate?
Well, you sort of used that example of 24-hour exercise. And we often oversimplify what endurance exercise is. We have this sort of preconceived idea, particularly in novices, sometimes in academics, certainly in undergrad students, in my experience, is that when you talk about endurance exercise, they just think it's steady rate and constant. But the reality is it's never like that. You have changes in topography, don't you? You have changes in direction around corners. If you're riding in a big group and you're at the back, you're going to be sprinting a lot more than people at the front. There's race tactics as well, which will chuck that sort of steady rate exercise completely out of the window. And so exercise is never at a set pace all of the time. It just simply can't be. It would be very boring if it was, of course. But the reality is that there are those periods of very intense work, even within that very submaximal exercise bout. And so it may well be that it's beneficial for that. If you look in the literature about what is shown to be benefited by taking bicarb, I mean, the latest meta-analysis work is, it's up to about sort of 12 minutes. But in reality, we know that that's just not the case. We have a study that came out last year that showed, using different methods of ingestion, that you get improvements to 16-kilometre time trial performance. And we've just done this 40-kilometre time trial performance. And some of that longer duration work has sort of been lost in the literature. People have sort of almost forgotten about it. There are quite a number of studies of an hour or more where you find improvements in performance. But again, when you've got trained or sort of fit individuals, but who aren't super familiarized with the sort of performance criterion that they use in the study, then your ability to find small differences in performance is pretty difficult, particularly when you go over an hour. The retest reliability of some of the protocols gets worse the longer the exercise. So it's sometimes quite difficult. So in that sense, sometimes I suppose we're a bit guilty of ignoring what the athlete feels like and what their feedback is. And I guess we should not say that it's important to use one anecdote, because that's definitely not evidence. But if you repeatedly are getting the same feedback from multiple athletes across the board, then there's got to be something in that as an approach. And what, as a field, the sport and exercise nutritionists need to do is try and capture some of these things, not just about bicarb, but about all these sorts of nutritional interventions. We're not very good at that. Many of us are quantitative scientists, and sometimes that qualitative stuff is underrepresented, I think. But it's equally really important, because it's what the athlete is feeling like at the time, and it's what they're reflecting on, and it's how they're evaluating either a training bout or how they're evaluating an intervention that you do with them. So I think sometimes, yes, the physiological stuff feeds into that, but how they feel is a vital component of that. And sometimes I think that's a little bit lost. So I think it might have an impact on perception, as we said already. So it might well be important for that. But any type of repeat exercise with, the traditional method of fartlek, which is not a very old term, but people still do that type of work. So intervals with intense bouts and recoveries, it'll certainly be useful for that.
There's a lot of lactate shuttling going on in those sort of situations, right? So that makes sense. Yeah.
The other thing to remember, though, is that quite frequently people confuse lactate, hydrogen ions, and lactic acid. Lactic acid doesn't exist in a human. which might blow some people's minds, but it's not there. Lactate and hydrogen ions are coincidentally produced through different mechanisms. Lactate is the important fuel. So it's really important as a fuel. And if you are unable to actually convert lots of pyruvate into lactate, you can't do intense exercise.
Yeah.
So that's a problem.
Despite
it's the
what we hear
hydrogen
from
ion.
commentators when watching races. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're listening, you just saw a big shrug come over Andy here. I'm sure it grinds his gears when he hears it. So
Yeah, just ever so slightly.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important issue. Is that lactate is not a problem. In fact, actually, it's very useful. So one of the things you also mentioned in your previous podcast was that sometimes you see that when you take bicarbonate, lactate goes up. It does. It does.
I really want to get into this. Because this is actually, before I do that, I need to ask a question that I had that came up. So just yesterday, as of recording this, they're going up the Galibier in the Tour de France. And that's a situation where you had a long stage, and, apply this to any big mountain stage, or particularly a queen stage, where typically it'll be a long day, far over an hour, before you get to the consequential moment of the climb.
Yeah.
Or of the stage. Typically a large climb, something like Ventoux, the Galibier, any of these big, long climbs that they have to do. This brings into question when to take the bicarbonate. It could be complex.
Yeah.
And this leads me to a question of, do we know if taking bicarbonate in an active state, number one, maybe that just causes so much gut distress that it's not that any benefit is thrown out the window. But have you looked into that, or are there any thoughts that you have about taking it in a mid-race environment, taking in bicarbonate?
Yeah, so there's a really nice study by Sebastian Daller and from Leuven University in Belgium, and they did a really nice job of using traditional method of delivery, just liquid, and they split dosed over 3 hours prior to the start of exercise, and then did small doses during 3 hours of simulated racing in a lab situation. And then they did a 90-second sprint at the end, and showed that sprint at the end is improved when you have this elevated blood bicarbonate response. Sometimes, though, it's a little bit inconvenient to do that. So that was, again, one of the sort of motivations from Morton to produce a product that might be able to improve the delivery of bicarb, but also elongate it. So we've extensively tested the bicarb in the pro peloton. There are multiple teams using it and have been using it. So Sepp Kuss used it when he won the Vuelta. Jumbo-Visma used it. For us. Yeah, Jumbo-Visma used it for 2 years. So, the riders see some benefit in it. I think the other important thing to remember is that your GC rider is not going to be doing much work until that crux point in the race. And so they're going to be sheltered. Yes, they'll be having to do a bit of work to get over some of the sort of lesser climbs. But when the intensity really goes up, so long as you've not burnt all those matches in the lead up to that, because they'll be looked after anyway, that blood bicarbonate is likely to be elevated, and so will allow you to do more work at that crux time. Some of the data that we've got, and this is just anecdotal from some of the sort of teams, is that some of them are measured blood bicarbonate the day after, and it's even then still elevated ever so slightly.
Interesting.
And again, we have no idea as to how or why that would be the case, but it's a really interesting observation. So again, how
do you practically ingest it during a race? Because I've taken, for example, I've taken the pills. Those pills would be an absolute mess. You'd be like, you'd be trying to grab a handful of pills, and you would be dropping them all over the place.
That looks very, very dodgy as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That will certainly raise some eyebrows.
Yeah, and then, especially in cycling with its checkered history.
Indeed. And then you could mix it into a bottle and then have your team car hand you that bottle. Yeah. But at the same time, as we've talked about, that is more likely to cause,
Yeah.
based on scientific research, it's more likely to cause gut distress. And
Yeah.
I've taken the Martem product, and it involves the process of mixing together the powder with water and then putting in the small micro tablets that you have. That certainly would not be feasible in the middle of a race. So how are they practically taking it?
So traditionally, before this product came along, a couple of the teams were ingesting it mid-race. But because they couldn't rely on the soigneurs or the nutrition staff to hand out bottles and the riders always get the bottle they wanted, often what they would do is start the race with a bottle with bicarb in on the frame, and then any of the other drinks that they needed, they would swap those in and out, as you see them frequently doing, and then they would save that bicarb dose. But often what they're having is quite a small dose, which is not necessarily associated with some of the GI upset. So it might be a 0.1 or 0.15 dose rather than a 0.3 dose. So they would have a bicarb dose prior to the start of the stage, and then top up once or twice, potentially, depending on the topography during the race. So at the moment, though, I mean, the majority of athletes will tinker, and we know that some of them are using the Morton bicarb product, and then they're also taking more traditional methods. And that, again, is part of the criticism of not of that as a methodology, but the fact that you never get to see that data. Now, if it's not, from my perspective, if it's not it's happening in a team that we don't have any sort of sponsorship deal or supply agreement with, then I would never get to see any of that data, which is quite disappointing. And I think one of it's almost like a call to arms. We need to, where there's not necessarily a commercially or a performance sensitive issue associated with publishing some of this data, we probably need to publish a bit more of it, because actually it can push the field on far more rapidly, rather than all this data being kept in house and nobody doing anything with it. I know that there's sometimes that you can't get away from the fact that they're using these manipulations as a competitive advantage, but at some point everybody else is going to work it out. And so when there's a bit of, when there's the status quo is leveled again, at that point I think people need to think a bit more about publishing that data, because it'd be very useful. Save us going down rabbit holes research-wise.
Yeah. So I would assume that if they're using the bicarb product during a race, they're almost consuming it like a gel. So in whichever holder or flask they would be taking it in, or perhaps they're watering it down.
They usually have it as a liquid.
Specific.
So
okay.
Yeah, certainly. I don't know for now, but historically, that's often what they do. Just take it as a liquid, and then they probably have it alongside something to eat in a gel, because we know that co-consuming carbohydrate also limits the GI upset. So our product has got the micro tablets, and they're small enough, we think, to pass through the pyloric sphincter in the stomach, so they don't hang around as much in the stomach. But then they're also encapsulated in the hydrogel, so it protects them from the gut acid. That's the way that it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's a fluid, then it's free to react with that. But again, some athletes get on with that fine. They don't have any problems. Others have a torrid time. So that's one of the things that I was, in my previous life as an academic, or solely as an academic, one of the next questions I had was what predicts, or what factors cause some people to have really bad GI upset and others not to. So others can take some 0.4 huge dose of bicarb, 0.4 grams per kilo in liquid form, no GI upset whatsoever, none.
Wow.
Other people have a terrible time. And then when they come back, sometimes they have less of a bad time, but then there doesn't seem to be a training effect either. So if you look at something like carbohydrate, if you throw loads of carbohydrate down your neck, there's definitely a familiarization effect. What we see is an increase in the total number of transporters for it. So it goes up. We've not seen that in individuals. So it'd be really interesting to work that out. If anyone wants to do that work, that'd be great. It'd be to answer a load of questions. But I think that's one of the things, and that's why there's such inter-individual variability here, is that
Yeah.
it might be that some people's bicarbonate response is very rapid. And, even in our paper with the Morton bicarb product, there is some inter-individual differences. If you look in that paper at one of the curves, we've plotted all the individual responses, and there is some variability. There's no doubt about it.
You mentioned co-ingestion. Are there any substances that when ingested alongside sodium bicarbonate seem to affect it in an adverse or I guess even a positive way?
Yeah, there's a few things actually. So dietary nitrate, there's some suggestions, although there's not that many studies on it, that the pH change might reduce the effectiveness of your ability to change nitrate into nitric oxide, which is what you need that's the end goal, if you like, for improving blood flow. So again, the data's not brilliant there, but there's a couple of studies that suggest that there might be not adverse, but it might make nitrate slightly less effective. There's again a mixed bag on caffeine co-ingestion, but again, the potential for caffeine to be ergogenic is likely to be to the mid to end part of endurance exercise. And also, if you look in pro cycling, almost everybody is a high caffeine ingestion or high caffeine user anyway. So again, sort of working out how those two things interact are quite difficult. Even trying to get people to abstain from caffeine is tricky enough because of obviously that you get some people are very high caffeine ingesters and others ingest it without actually realizing it at times. One of the things that might be quite potentially beneficial in terms of, and again, co-ingestion studies, there aren't that many. And there are so many potential products and potential interactions that you might have. Creatine, beta-alanine, those two, there seems to be some evidence to suggest that if you co-ingest with bicarbonate, you get an increase in the overall impact. And that's because they're working in a different mechanism. So the mechanisms are for bicarb that it's extracellular. So it's trying to move hydrogen ions and lactate out of the cell more effectively. And so it then works in that extracellular space. Whereas beta-alanine increases carnosine concentrations. And then that's an intracellular buffer. So it works in the inside the muscle rather than outside of it. And creatine works in a sort of potentially similar fashion. So there seems to be, because they're completely different mechanisms, there seems to be an additive effect. But again, there's not millions of studies on that, but there's some interesting data on both those. And it's interesting because lots of recreational riders will be using creatine and they'll be using beta-alanine anyway. So, but it's probably not going to do you any harm to take both of those things.
Yeah, like you mentioned in the pre-workout market, there's a whole lot of, tossed everything into a powder, and they could be taking who knows what.
Well, beta-alanine is a classic because if you have too much, it gives you paresthesia, and then you start tingling, and you go, "Oh, this must be working."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Makes you tingle, so it works. Can I ask another question here? This one's perhaps, I don't know if there's research on this, but does bicarbonate ingestion hinder performance in like endurance performance for athletes in any way? Like, for example, maybe it's a certain type of effort or something else or anything. Have you found it to hinder performance?
Not as far as I'm aware. One of the things that is quite interesting, again, there's very little on this, is that actually delivering high sodium load might potentially also be ergogenic, particularly for exercise when it's hot.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had contact with a few teams who are interested in, not necessarily in cycling, but they're interested in the potential of using bicarbonate, one, to improve performance, but also to encourage players to drink more in recovery, because we know that it will drive thirst. So one of the things that you might also find when you take bicarb is that the next day you're slightly heavier. It won't be massive amounts, but it might be that what it's doing is that subconsciously you're actually thirstier, so you take on slightly more liquid. So some riders report they feel heavier the next day, which actually, if you're doing repeated days in the heat, is probably a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there are those sorts of observations. Again, these things are not systematically investigated. There's a couple of studies, one by Jason Siegler, who has done a nice study on sort of using it to potentially to hyperhydrate people, but the water storage is not huge. It's certainly not dangerous in any way. But it's interesting when you've got somebody who's finely tuned, really knows how they work. They can often detect even small changes like that without getting on the scales. They know that they feel different. But again, we think that might potentially be beneficial. Obviously, if it's a short hilly time trial the next day, then that might not necessarily be the right thing to do, because those small differences may make a difference. But we're only ever talking sort of 250 mils, 500 mils, so that's only 250 to 500 grams, so it's quite a small amount.
Yeah, exactly. And we always overemphasize in our cyclists, I should say, not speaking for your researchers, but us cyclists always overemphasize the impact of weight compared to the positive effects that we could have for having more water on board.
Well, that's why we're all riding carbon bikes, obviously.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. We talked about so in a logical mind might be coming to this fresh and think that, okay, so if I take bicarbonate, I'm going to have less lactate in my blood. That's going to it's going to take it out. But you mentioned the fact that you witnessed the other side of things, that actually it enables perhaps more lactate production. Can you go into why that might be happening? Because for some, it may seem counterintuitive.
So if you were to do about like a time trial, for instance, when we do that, when we look in the lab at that type of exercise, lactate is likely to go up. So mentioned already that if you're creating optimal conditions for glycolysis in the muscle and you're forcing the muscle to contract intensely over a long period, then a product of that high carbohydrate turnover is going to be lactate. So if you optimize the conditions for that, it might be that you produce more. Again, it's not 100% that that's the precise mechanism, but it's a possibility. But really the main way that it works is that what we see is an improvement in efflux in hydrogen ions, but also in lactate. That means that it moves out of the muscle cell much more quickly. So it's really that's happening. It's creating the optimal conditions and stimulating the transporters for lactate to move out of the muscle cell quickly. And so if you have a higher concentration, and it's longer duration exercise, if there's more lactate available, then you can potentially use that directly in other muscle to generate energy, because it's an energy substrate, or you can use it to maintain blood glucose, because we know that it can go to the liver, be turned into glucose. So that process of gluconeogenesis, where you're using what was seen as a byproduct of metabolism, but is an important energy substrate, is also there, and is being used to maintain blood glucose potentially. And that's obviously useful because if you're having to do something like a technical descent, or you're sprinting, or something that requires cognitive function, and you can maintain blood glucose better, then you're less likely to make a bad decision.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, we don't know if we don't know if the bicarb is going to have those sorts of effects cognitively, but there are potential impacts of having higher lactate.
And it's really interesting that we don't really know if it allows the body to produce more, or if it's just shuttling and pulling it out more right out into the bloodstream. It shows really like how complex all of this really is, and we're viewing it from a window of understanding from where we've been. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have a comprehensive knowledge of exactly how our body works.
Yeah, and it's not like, some of the studies that look at fuel use across a muscle, they're really invasive. You need to have a blood sample from the arterial feed, and then you need a blood sample from the venous circulation. So that's the difference between the sort of metabolites going into the muscle and that coming out. Then you also need to combine that with a muscle biopsy to see what's happening inside the muscle. Now, if you're going to look at lactate, then you either use radio-labeled lactate, potentially, and use isotopes to do that, or you have to work out where it's going. And you can't do that by looking at the arteriovenous difference, because it could be going to any number of different sites, brain, heart, liver, And so it's really difficult to pin down exactly the precise mechanism of that. But what we do know is that if you take bicarb, you'll often do more exercise for less stress. So perceived exertion is clamped, seemingly, because if it's self-paced exercise, that's likely to stay the same. Heart rate's usually the same. And in this 40-kilometre time trial study, we show that VO2 is the same, but they do more work. So it might be gross efficiency is also different. So there's a few things going on there that we need to do more work on, but which are super interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You're using conditional language, not absolute language, when you're talking about the fact that lactate in some cases goes up. Have you seen it go down in certain subjects when they take sodium bicarbonate? Asking for a friend, aka me.
Not personally, no. Not personally, no.
So this is where I get to ask you my questions, and I don't expect you to have all the answers to all these things. But I produce I've always, in all of the lactate tests I've done, I produce a lot of lactate, much higher than normal. If, for example, if I'm riding at like a maximal lactate steady state and I'm riding, so something akin to FTP or right around FTP, meaning that like slightly lower than that, but an effort that I can sustain. It's like that 7 out of 10 sort of effort where if I'm going to continue that for an hour, I'm going to pop probably, but I'll be able to hold it roughly around there. When I'm doing that, it's not uncommon for me to see values around, we're talking 7 to 9 for my lactate values. And then in like peak, like to failure tests, getting all the way up to 12 and even above 12. The highest I've seen is up to 14.
That's not that high.
And because I've seen some studies where some people, like I saw a slalom skier, they were testing a slalom skier right after finishing one. I think he was up to 22.
I've had 23 out of myself.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I'm not the typical falling right at the typical thresholds that people find in terms of lactate numbers. No, maybe we can discuss if that's perhaps not following those norms is more common than we think, or if these are anomalies, and if you have any insight to why somebody might be a higher lactate producer, assuming that they're not just unhealthy and taking in a really, just like a high fructose corn syrup diet where they're just varying the color of the high fructose corn syrup.
Yeah. So obviously the amount of carbohydrates that you have available will have an impact on lactate production. If you've got high carbohydrate diet, or you've had high carbohydrate pre-exercise meal, or you're doing these sorts of steady rate exercise tests and you're consuming carbohydrate during, then you're providing carbohydrate. And so we know that one of the byproducts or end products of glycolysis is going to be lactate. And we know that there's an interaction there because we know that when you've got high blood glucose concentrations, that has an impact on insulin. So insulin will go up, and then that directly has an impact on the rate of fat metabolism. But we know that also that lactate will also suppress fat metabolism in that sort of scenario, which is, again, might well answer some of your questions. So it might just be that, that your diet predisposes you to having higher lactate concentrations. It's also likely to be to do with fiber type. In ultra endurance individuals, they're very oxidative in nature. We'll use that term. Their muscle fibers are not those explosive types. They're not going to produce lots of, I use the terrible term anaerobic glycolysis because it's in all textbooks, but it's not strictly speaking correct because there's always plenty of oxygen available. It just chooses not. It just chooses not to use it. But what we're talking about is a fiber type which produces lots of lactate. If you're predisposed and you've got a genetic predisposition to having lots of those, then your blood lactate concentration is likely to be higher. Likewise, it might be to do with the number of transporters and your ability to uptake and deliver lactate into the blood. So it might be actually that you're quite good at staying at a high value and that you're producing a lot, but actually you're also uptaking it quite effectively. It's when it starts to go up very quickly at low intensities that it's a problem potentially, because it means that your rate of glycolysis is very high and you're not effectively using it. So it's starting to build up. That means that you're probably going to run out of steam. It's unlikely to be that it's directly the lactate, but it's indicative of, you not being in that steady state. It's indicative of you, passing thresholds. The only way back from that will be to slow down. So there's a few of these potential mechanisms, but 12 at max is not that high. In an endurance-trained individual, you would expect at submaximal exercise them to have relatively lower lactate values. But then at max, if you're reasonably well-trained, you would expect that you would have much higher lactate responses because you're more effective at using carbohydrate.
Correct.
So
my curve tends to start low and stay low, and then it experiences very rapid acceleration in between, really, like in between LT1 to LT2 is like where we start to see that change, that curve get more steep than perhaps what you would see with most individuals. And that's where, and it's interesting because my whole life growing up, I never did any sort of endurance exercise other than, I guess you could consider motocross an endurance exercise, and if it was long enough. But most of us kids and amateurs, we didn't do 30-minute motos or anything else like that. It was shorter. But ski racing and that sort of thing. And I did have a propensity when I started cycling, but so do most people, to be better at shorter stuff than they do long stuff. That's how it works for most of us, because that depth that you build from aerobic training over a long period of time, it takes a while to get really good at the long stuff. And these days in particular, I'm very good at longer, sustained efforts. I'm not as good as the shorter, harder sort of things, yet my lactate values still remain quite high in these sort of tests, that I'm doing. So, and when I've taken bicarbonate, and I need to do more back-to-back tests with this, but when I've taken it, I see somewhere roughly around a 5 to 10% reduction. I've done 5 tests with this, but a 5 to 10% reduction in my blood lactate values. Whereas with others, I've seen that blood lactate goes up with them, and yet their RPE feels the same, and everything else is the same. They, or I should say, for their power, if you control for power, their RPE is lower. It feels like it's not as difficult for them. Yeah. So it's really, it's confounding to me to wonder why mine would be dropping. And I kind of had this question, and I don't even know if it's feasible or practical. It's coming from an uninformed person myself. Is there a regulating effect that perhaps bicarbonate could have? Like, is there an ideal amount of lactate that could exist within the body in an active state, and as a result, perhaps sodium bicarbonate could be helping finding that kind of balance, so to speak, or that ideal level? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure about that, to be honest. Don't think I'm not aware of any work that's there looking at that specifically. I think because there's such individual variation in some of these lactate responses, I don't think it's something that anybody has particularly looked at systematically. I'm not aware of anything. I might be wrong, but off the top of my head, I'm not aware that there is these sorts of investigations.
Well, that's interesting. I'm going to keep doing tests with myself to see if I can figure that out. I've even gone through periods of time where I basically abstained from anything remotely close to sugar. And I was like, maybe I'm missing, because a lot of the time our perspective on our diet is different than the reality on our diet, right? But I've gone through that, and it hasn't had any notable effect on value either.
Reducing the amount of carbohydrate in your diet across the board for endurance sport is not a great idea.
Confirmed. Yeah.
And also, if you do it in the short term quite severely, you're likely to also be immunosuppressed. So you're likely to lose training days through being, having upper respiratory tract infections. Again, not a great idea.
No, absolutely not. Well, this is all fascinating. I certainly am interested to see the productization, if you will, of bicarbonate as things start to develop and as we get more research, and not only, scientific research coming from studies, but then everything else. We've seen that Martin has introduced this, and I'm curious to see where it goes. We have caffeine coming through different avenues in different products and all different things. So it'll be really interesting to see. Andy, I'm really appreciative of your time. I'm sure our listeners reflect that as well. Are there any other final notes that you would want to point out, or perhaps something that we didn't cover here?
No, not really. I mean, we've been fairly extensive in the things that we've covered. I think one of the things that you mentioned in the previous podcast was that you sort of liked the idea that Morton are investing in actually doing some of these studies. And I think one of the previous comments was also that, that perhaps we did a study that was on exercise, but we didn't publish that. We just published the other one because it was inconvenient. We're quite happy to publish all of the studies that we're doing, and we have a commitment to doing research because we've so many questions as a nutrition team. We want to answer these questions because we're getting questions from the people using our products. So whilst the literature is quite good at providing us lots of answers and lots of proposed mechanisms, often with a new product, you might have an idea about how it would work theoretically. And that when you use it with an athlete, it does seem to work, but you still want to underpin that potential performance improvement and that perception of the fact that it might work. You want to underpin that with good quality research. So that's exactly the sort of ethos that we have. We want to answer questions, generate new questions, but then also address some of the questions that users of the products have, because we don't have things to hide. We want to answer these questions openly.
Yeah, we're appreciative of brands like Martin that do that, right? That are willing to fund research and then also just publish their findings that they find throughout the process. So
yeah, and you mentioned that the sort of full disclosure statement in the previous podcast about this. This is funded by Morton. I didn't work for them at the time. I do now. But the issue, I guess, is that, as you rightly identified, very few grants are available for academics to make people ride bikes quickly. It's quite tricky to do that.
Larger problems to solve.
Yeah, and so if you've got a health issue, then it's much easier to find a pot of money to apply for. But making people ride quickly on bikes or run fast is not a high sort of health and well-being priority for many government organisations. So it's quite hard to do that. So the nutrition, sports nutrition is full of studies which are funded by industry because they're the only ones who want to answer those questions. But I know from personal experience that you're not always allowed to publish the findings that you have. And certainly I've got some experience previously of doing funded research work where there's moratoriums on publishing, where unless the findings are actually put a positive spin on a product, then that doesn't see the light of day. That's not something that we want to sort of enter into as an organisation. We want full disclosure, and what you see is what you get.
I love that transparency. We're proud funders of research here too at TrainerRoad. We've funded various different studies that have gone on, and researchers, if you have studies that you need funding for or problems that you want to solve that do involve making cyclists faster, it's a problem that we're focused on solving. I know there's bigger problems in the world, but we care about that one a lot. So if you do have that sort of thing, reach out to us. You can contact us through trainerroad.com/podcast or send me an email directly. It's just my name at trainerroad.com. And you can reach out to me and we can talk about it. We're passionate about that. So Andy, I'm really grateful for the work you're doing. It's super exciting to hear how we're making people faster, and grateful to Martin for allowing you to be able to do this sort of thing and discuss this openly. It's just awesome. So thanks a bunch, Andy. If people have any questions about anything in this podcast, I'll leave them down in the notes below. I probably won't be able to find all the studies that have just been referenced by Andy, but I'll find as many as I can and I'll put them down below. And then, of course, and this is not a plug requested by Andy or Martin at all, but if you do want to try the product that he's been talking about, it is actually available. Yes, it's quite expensive. Yes, it's tough to be able to, get your hands on it and be able to do everything. It's not quite as easy as just taking a gel, but it's out there. And there's research showing that not only does it give you less gut distress, but also sounds like there's forthcoming research that's showing that it also makes you faster. So if you want to try that, I feel like that's something we could do to help out these companies that publish transparent research and are doing this sort of thing to help us get faster. It's pretty cool. All right. Thanks a bunch, Andy. And hopefully we'll be excited to get you on at some point when that other research is published that talks about performance improvement. It could be great to have you on.
Yeah, great. Great to talk to you.